How are you?
Hello, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. You got a haircut. It looks good.
Yeah, I got a haircut, shaved. It's
Yeah.
yeah, we're good to go.
Your background looks nice too.
Yeah, I got a new place in San Francisco,
Hmm.
um, and I'm just in a different part of the house. I should do this more
Hmm.
often. I'm actually setting up a podcast studio, proper one here
Nice.
soon.
Huh.
Yeah, when you come SF, you're welcome to stay over.
I'd be
With
happy to.
yeah, yeah.
I should do an SF trip in the next couple months. But let's
What are you?
yeah, let's talk about that later. The artistic style in the background you've got is cool. I haven't seen that style before, but it's
Oh, sweet.
interesting. Yeah.
Oh,
So today we have Mesopotamian history,
yes.
and Mesopotamia. Uh, So I arrange History 102 chronologically on the YouTube channel, and this will almost certainly be the first episode in that chronology. If there ends up being a video about the invention of agriculture or the last ice age, I'm going to be very surprised. Who knows? Maybe Samo's right and they'll discover a new civilization um, from the last ice age that we end up covering. But hi, everyone. If you're starting the show here, I want to say hello. Thank you for coming. Continue to watch. We have a lot of content.
Yes.
And for like every history of the world you read, this is going to be the start of it. And so Mesopotamia is always the first chapter of your history of the world. And I am going to write my own history of the world in the next few years at some point. And my big barrier to entry is I just have to read 5 books on like the start of civilization because that's a time period that it's difficult to really there's like not a lot of books written about it, but I do know enough about Mesopotamia to make this video. And so we're looking at a 3,000 year time frame, and something that I've said from the Mesopotamian civilization video is that we are closer to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to the builder of the pyramids. And it's very similar to how we are closer to Tyrannosaurus rex than Tyrannosaurus rex was to the Stegosaurus. History is a very big place. And the irony is that when the pyramids were built in 2700 BC, Mesopotamia was already 500 years old. So this is a very, very old civilization. And Mesopotamia inhabits the area of modern Iraq, which is called Mesopotamia, which is Greek for the land between the rivers, where that whole area of the world is very dry. And Baghdad sits at the latitude of Austin, Texas, actually, which is interesting. But I've been looking up temperatures in the Middle East, and at Medina and Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad is from, it can be it's even worse further south. In the area around Djibouti, it's 90 degrees in January. So this is a very warm, dry, arid area of the world. And the only places where civilization can survive in this part of the world is around river systems. And so, for everyone who took elementary school history classes, I'm sure you know about the area called the Fertile Crescent, which is stretches from Egypt, the Nile River, out through Syria and Palestine, and then hooks back around to Iraq. And this is where civilization started. And there are fundamentally 3 cultural designations. You have the Canaanites or Syrians in the middle, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians, and they're all the founders of modern civilization. And Mesopotamia is Greek for land between the rivers, where you have the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and they are really unpleasant rivers. Where the Nile is a very good river; it flows regularly, it's very fertile, and with the Tigris and the Euphrates, it's just constant flooding, and it's the water patterns aren't normal, and it's very erratic. And it's interesting to compare Mesopotamian versus Egyptian mythology, because in Egyptian mythology, and to be fair, we don't really trust Egypt's records because Egypt was a single totalitarian government. And I've read a very interesting history of Egypt that said that we need to read about ancient Egypt similarly to how we look at Stalinist Russia. So the Egyptian records aren't fully trustworthy, but from what we know about Egypt, they saw their gods as loving and caring. And for the Mesopotamian gods, their conception of the universe is that the world is the constant battle between order and chaos. And this is immortalized in the Mesopotamian legends of Marduk and Tiamat, where the Babylonian head god was named Marduk. And Marduk was the warrior god who killed the saltwater dragon goddess Tiamat. And Tiamat is symbolic of chaos. And so their worldview is that we are constantly fighting against chaos, and it's the role of the government to protect us from chaos. And that's it shows that their society is very authoritarian focused, it's very order based, it's very collectivist. And this is a pretty good book, Against the Grain, by James C. Scott. James C. Scott is one of my favorite leftist anarchist authors, and this is a history of the adoption of early agriculture. And one of the fascinating theses of that book is he said that the move from farming to civilization was not consensual, where our idea and most people's conceptions of this time period are formed from what they learned when they were 12, where for the way the school systems are formed, you spend a lot of time on ancient civilizations and then your teachers kind of give up. And so we view this as this glorious rise of civilization. And the reality is it was often just oppressive governments forcing people to work, where in most cases, the earliest form of labor in any society is slavery. That's something where Karl Marx was basically right, where farming formed 10,000 years ago in the area of modern Kurdistan, which historians have called the hilly flanks, Turkey, Iran, Armenia, that area. And over time, the agriculture percolated southwards. And again, this book does a great job, Against the Grain. And there was a 5,000 year period because agriculture was invented around 10,000 BC, and the first city started at 5,000 BC. And this is something Samo talks a lot about with where he thinks there was an older civilization around the time of the last ice age. I am not picking a horse in this race. I have no idea. It could happen, could not. And so you have cities like Çatalhöyük in Turkey. And Çatalhöyük, we think it was built for a temple site. And so civilization developed. Partly there was a real drought period that really crippled the area, so people started farming as a way to get around the drought period. And also, there was a religious site called Çatalhöyük, and we think that people moved into settled places for the religious, to build religious monuments. But the truth is, like, we have no clue of this era of history. In 20 years, the narrative at this time period will be completely different than it is today. And this is why I study history and not prehistory. Because in prehistory, every 15 years, the narrative completely changes. I have zero faith that the narrative that we have now is the correct one. But if you're studying the 100 Years' War or the American Civil War, we can be pretty confident that we know most of the important facts. And so agriculture developed in the area around Iraq, and archaeologically, the Middle East was a different place in climate than it is today, where back then, I think the area of the modern Middle East had a climate that was more like Texas, where southern Iraq, which is now just desert, it's crazy to look at photos. It's just sand dunes everywhere. That was a swamp. It was like Florida. It was just southern Iraq was this huge swamp. And it's crazy that if you look at archaeology of this time period, you can find that Chad in Central Africa was 4 times its current size. It was like Mega Chad. And so the Sahara was wet. Arabia was wet. In the Bible, they call Israel the land of milk and honey. And Israel legitimately had a much wetter, more fertile climate back then. So the Middle East was pretty different in this time period. And if you look at archaeological finds of what people drew of what the climate of the area was like, the Middle East had a significantly wetter climate. You had elephants, you had lions, you had rhinoceroses, you had oryx, which are these extinct mega cows. So it's pretty different. And for both Arabia and for Arabia, the Middle East and Egypt, civilization was founded because the climate got drier. And I'm going to keep referencing this book. This is legitimately one of the best written history books I've read. James C. Scott's the man. And he says that people do not willingly submit to civilization. And what that means is that for most tribal groups, people just live their lives, they have their clan, they have their tribal culture. And for most tribal history, if you don't like your chieftain, you move to a different tribe. If you don't want to work, you don't work. And so these tribal peoples have this very like lax, very smooth, very like disorganized culture. And that's really what most people want. But how do you get to a place where you have a government, where you have taxes, where you have cities, is because you end up in a situation where the elites have leverage over the population. And so if you look at one of the interesting things is that the spread of agriculture was in almost all cases a story of genocide, where agriculture developed in the Middle East, it developed in China, a couple other places. And in almost every case, the farmers got a bigger population, and then they moved out and genocided the hunter-gatherers because the hunter-gatherers didn't. It's nigh impossible to get a hunter-gatherer population to adopt agriculture because the lifestyle is so different and the values are so different, which is a big reason why the whites genocided the hunter-gatherer peoples of the Americas or Australia. And so what happened in the Middle East is that as the climate got drier and the monsoon pattern shifted further south, is that the Middle East became the desert that it is today. And so people had to cluster around the river systems to survive. And this happened in Egypt too. So this is why Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilization formed at the same time, where you had to live along the rivers. And Mesopotamia was very strange for a society of this pre-industrial era. Where in pre-industrial societies, it's normal that 90% of the population is rural and 10% is urban. Mesopotamia was strange in that it was a city-state culture. And city-states have existed for the Mayans, the Greeks, various other peoples. Italian Renaissance, city-states tend to be societies that are forming, a very young society. And then once one city-state gets big enough, it crushes the other city-states. Then you form an empire, then the society goes into decline, etc. And so you saw the formation of these city-states in southern Iraq, in this area that used to be a swampland, but then became desert. And government formed as you mobilized labor to fight for you, not to fight for you, that too, but to build irrigation ditches. And so what happened is you developed government in cities because you needed to have hundreds of guys to dig these irrigation ditches in order to keep people alive. And like, as a Californian, you must have seen irrigation. It's really big out in the Central Valley. It's just these huge thousands of acres with water, and that could only grow in that climate. And so you saw the whole image we talked about before of their society viewing the government as the protector against chaos. That developed because you needed to have mass mobilization in order to keep the society running, to keep all the irrigation ditches going, to keep the civilization operating. And so the 90% rural urban thing, 90% of the population lived inside the city walls. So the way these societies worked is that you would go out and farm, but you lived inside the city walls. And so southern Iraq was filled with all these city-states, like Lagash or Umma or Uruk or Kish, and they existed as these warring states. And that's how civilization formed.
Hey, sorry, you cut out for maybe 10
Oh,
seconds.
yeah. So I said that there were all these warring city-states like Lagash, Umma, Kish, Uruk that were self-enclosed, where people would go out and farm the local fields, and they were constantly at war with each other. And people would live in these city-states to protect themselves against war with other peoples. Do you have any questions?
Not at the moment. Just as trying to keep track, but let's keep going on.
Exactly. And warfare determines a society's government, where if you know the kind of soldiers a society has, you know what its government's going to be. And so in a society where you get a bunch of guys with guns and they fight other people, you're going to have a democracy or a a populist dictatorship. In a society where a handful of knights on horseback win battles, you're going to have an aristocracy where the nobility manage everything. And so in this era of Mesopotamian warfare, it was blanks. It was not blanks. It was ranks of spearmen, like they're like the ancient Greek hoplites. And so, ironically, I think democracy might be the wrong word, but in Mesopotamian society of this era, you have these councils of elders. And so the councils of the elders ran society. And what happened was that the priests took over society. Because if you're in a culture like that, where everyone has to survive against the elements, what happens is that you are terrified that if you don't get rain, everyone's going to die. And so in ancient farming societies, it was run by the priest class. And the priest did all of these rituals to assuage people's anxiety. So you sacrifice people, you do the rain dance, in order to you sacrifice people, you do the rain dance in order to get the gods to make it rain. And so that's why all of these ancient irrigation societies were theocracies. And the councils of the elders were managed by the priests. And it's really hard to overestimate how important religion was for Mesopotamians, where they are legitimately a theocracy, where the Middle East for its entire history has been a theocracy. And the priests owned like between a third to half of the land. And the priests, every single part of your life was in some way religious. And there are some like hyper reactionary rightist thinkers who say this is the ultimate like aim of society. That Avola writes about how it's a perfect society when everyone constantly has spiritual connection to the world. And I think there is a valid case there, but also I don't like when I lived in Peru, the locals have all of these weird superstitions that past a certain point you just think are stupid. And over time, the Mesopotamian religion became stultifying and it became fossilized. And that's the thing you see with every civilization. Past a point, every single civilization fossilizes due to one ruling class seizing power. And so there's a quote about ancient India that fits very well for the later Mesopotamian priest classes, which is they think they got so good at they think their rituals are so good that they tamed the gods. And so by the end, the Mesopotamian religion had just completely devolved into superstition and lucky charms. And the way that works is that their concept of religion is not our concept of religion. And I'm going to bring up the Peruvians again, because Peru, when it was conquered by the Spanish, was at a similar civilizational level as to what Iraq was in this time period, where in Peru, everyone's Catholic, but they're not Catholic in a way that makes sense to Americans. Where for an American, if you're a Christian, you go to church, you pray, you try to be more like God. If you're in Peru, or if you're in Peru and you're not like in a major city or you're not of a certain social class, religion means you go to mass and then the priest cleans you of your sins, or you perform certain rituals to clean yourself of sins. And societies on a certain level of development see the world all through magic. And they don't have a concept of rationality. They don't have a concept of rationality. They don't have a concept of objectivity. Everything is mystically connected to everything else through magic. And so in Mesopotamian culture, you would have these idols. You'd have a statue of the god, and each city would have their own god. And so you would venerate the idol of your city. And so you would give your city's idol, you would give them food, you would give them sex, strangely enough. In Mesopotamian civilization, sex was they didn't have any taboos about it, so temples would literally have prostitutes. They would give the gods veneration, rituals. I think they had human sacrifices early on, which they phased out. And what would happen is that if your city was doing well, your god would rise. And so what would happen is that as Babylon became the dominant city-state, the Babylonian god, Marduk, rose to be the dominant god in Mesopotamia. and the other gods of the lesser cities fell, because if Babylon conquered the other city states, their god by definition was superior to the other gods. It's a mental system that makes sense if you think about it, but it's so alien to our mental system that it's hard to get moderns to think about it. And so the Bible in the Old Testament was written as a reaction to the fall of Mesopotamian civilization, where the Jews were kind of like the Mormons, where the Mormons left American society and they moved out to the desert to avoid America. And the Jews were like that, where, funnily enough, we've proven the existence of Abraham. We've looked at all of Abraham's genetics, and there was a guy at that time who is the Y chromosome for all the people descending who claim descent from Abraham. And so Abraham fled Uruk, the Mesopotamian city, to form the Jews. And so a lot of stuff in the Bible comes from Mesopotamian culture. The Mesopotamians have a Garden of Eden story. They have a flood story. They have, if you read the Bible, you see a lot of parallels to Mesopotamian civilization. And the Jews were towards the end, Mesopotamian civilization became so degenerate and stupid that you saw all of these people who were actively trying to escape it. And that's how the Jews were formed. And so run by a priest class over time becomes less creative. And Mesopotamian civilization, it was creative in the beginning, and then over time it lost the ability to be creative. And one of the ways this time period is written, again, the entire understanding of this time period is at like a 12-year-old's level, because most people's comprehension of ancient civilizations come from what they read in middle school. And so they act like the Mesopotamians were this advanced, beautiful civilization. And they were the most advanced people in the world, don't get me wrong, but they stopped making any new discoveries past a certain point. And that's the problem when your society is a collectivist autocratic theocracy. And so we've covered the development of Mesopotamian society in general. And then over time, you saw the warfare between the different Iraqi city-states. And I said before, we have places like Lagash or Kish or Umma or Uruk, and none of these places are particularly important. You don't have to remember them. I'm sure they were incredibly important to the people at the time, but none of them really bear much importance on your life. And you should know them only because they are the first places that we ever have records of. So the first war that we have on record is the war between Lagash and Umma. And I think Lagash beat Umma, but I don't remember. And so this is Sumeria. And Sumeria is the first civilization of that part of the world. It's in southern Iraq. And the Sumerians, they have a language completely unrelated to anything else we know of. And the Sumerians built these giant pyramids. All societies of this era built pyramids. The Egyptians were just better at it. The Central Americans built pyramids. The Egyptians built pyramids. The Iraqis built pyramids. The Chinese built pyramids. And so there's a theory that they built pyramids because they were from Armenia originally, and they wanted to rebuild the mountains of their home country. But that could be totally wrong. We don't know. And so the Sumerians developed this society, and then over time, the Sumerians went through their life course. But in the process of that, they developed sailing, or they developed the sail. They developed a lot of modern agriculture. They developed the first cities. They developed writing. The Sumerians, for the first people, developed writing. They had a system called cuneiform. And so with the Sumerians is the rise of the first civilization. And civilization is from the Greek, the Latin word cives, meaning cities. And so a civilization is a society that lives in cities. And if you live in cities, there's a bunch of other cultural technologies attached to it, like the ability, normally, every single urban society normally has a government, a writing system, a financial market, and all that stuff. And I give the Mesopotamians a supreme amount of credit for doing that, where they are the first advanced society in the world. And for example, writing was invented because you needed to keep government records where you had to keep track of these people paid taxes to us, these people gave us blank, and you do see a pretty Mesopotamia was the first society in the world with a market, and so it's funny to look at Mesopotamia and you see all of these very modern institutions. You have rent, you have a stock market, you have like interest paying loans, and you have money. And it's funny that all of these old institutions that we see as hyper modern things, you could put back 4,000 years ago. And the Mesopotamians also developed a law code because you have to use written laws if you want to manage people on beyond an interpersonal level. And so if you're in a tribal society where everyone knows each other, you have these implicit social rules that control how you operate. But if you're in a city and you're dealing with all these different tribal peoples, you have to have written down rules to arbitrate legal disputes. And so the Code of Hammurabi is a famous example of that. And the Code of Hammurabi has become famous because it's a system in which, or it's the first legal code that we know of. And the Code of Hammurabi is famous for an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that's very much the Mesopotamian value system, where for example, if your son murders someone else's son, they have the right to murder your son. And you can see that the Mesopotamians were developing an elementary philosophy of human relationships. And the Bible tried to move past that because as Christ said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth makes the world blind. And so as Sumeria gradually grew weaker, Akkad rose. And so if you want to look at the map of Mesopotamia, Sumeria is in the south around modern Kuwait. North of that, around modern Baghdad, it's Akkad. And a lot of you would know about Akkad from the right-wing celebrity Sargon of Akkad. And he named him after Sargon. And Sargon launched the first empire in history. And Sargon's empire went the distance from the Mediterranean or modern Syria until the Gulf. And that was the first empire in world history. And Sargon was able to mobilize the Akkadians, who were a fringe barbarian people, and they conquered Sumeria. And Akkadia, for about 2 generations, was the great empire that unified all of Mesopotamia. And with that came the decline of the Sumerian Empire. And Akkadian became like the Latin of that era, where once Sargon of Akkad established the first empire, you saw that region never went back to city-states, where it moved from the city-state level to the imperial level. And so that resulted in a change of the culture. And beforehand, it was run by the priest class. And for the entire period, Mesopotamia was priest class. And over time, the Mesopotamians had a system where every year that they were at war, they had a war king and they had a peace king. And the thing is, when you're in permanent war, the war king never leaves power. And the Native Americans, interestingly, had a similar system. And over time, the war kings installed themselves as emperors. And Mesopotamia was a system, Sumeria was a military dictatorship system where people would rise to power through brute force. Then someone else would kill them. And it was just constant intrigue. And with Akkad and with the empires, you saw the rise of a genuine king, which was a new concept of that time period. And over time, and this relates to the concept of the empire and the king, over time, the average Mesopotamian's life got worse. And this is one of those things where Mesopotamia was there for 3,000 years. I don't want to generalize. It's just such a huge time period. And just to get through this video, we're going to have to cut out so much content between when the Babylonians built a great wall against northern barbarians, or there was this economic crisis in southern Iraq when the soil became too salty to farm, or when the Elamites invaded Babylon. But keep in mind, I am cutting out 90% of the history of this society in order to make a comprehensible video. And I am mostly cutting out 90% because no one knows half of it. This is a poorly recorded society. Even the greatest historian in this time period doesn't know half of the things going on. However, over time, as the state got more powerful, the average person's life got worse. And by the end, when the Persians conquered Babylon, 3/4 of the population were debt slaves. And it's crazy, and this is the thing we talked about in the Russia video, to think that there could be a country where 80% of people are slaves. And there's an author named Michael Hudson who's written about this, about how debt slavery is a big sign of civilizational decline, where once most of the population become debt slaves, your civilization is dead. And what happened over time is you moved from a military system based off guys with spears. And when the guys with spears are the ones fighting, you have a certain sense of equality because we all have spears together. And when you move to a system with chariots, the chariots are super expensive. And a single chariot could wipe out an entire army of guys with spears and arrows. And so the chariots were to the ancient world what tanks are to the modern world, where the chariots could just steamroll their enemies. And the ability to use chariots determined power. So that's why you moved to the empire and the king, because the people who could buy the most chariots were those who dominated the game. And chariots were so expensive that it resulted in the centralization of power. And once you've centralized power, it means normal people are treated like crap because they can't fight back against the government. And so a big reason that the Bronze Age world failed was because the government got so powerful and the aristocracy got so powerful that normal people didn't have a stake inside the system. And what happened after Akkad is that the Babylonians showed up. And the Babylonians were a Semitic people, and the Akkadians were Semitic peoples. And the Semites are the modern Arabs, the Jews. The area from North Africa into the Middle East are Semitic speakers today. And the Semites are from Arabia. And so the Babylonians and the Akkadians came out of the Arabian desert, and Sumeria and Mesopotamia were constantly facing invaders coming out of Arabia. It was the big plight on their society. And the Babylonians, or as they were called originally, Amorites. You'll hear a lot about Amorites in the Bible. The Amorites showed up and they established the city of Babylon. And Babylon started out as irrelevant, but over time it rose to become the complete dominant player of the region, where of any country in the Mesopotamian world, Babylon was consistently the one that was on top the most. And Babylon established an empire that consistently controlled the southern half of Iraq, old Sumeria. And it's just hard to talk about Babylon. It's so long and so much happened. And you had two Babylonian empires. You had the old Babylonian Empire and the new Babylonian Empire. And Babylon itself went through this huge evolution from being this warrior barbarian people to being this great glorious empire to being this decadent, completely failing society. And Babylon became the Paris and the Rome of Mesopotamia, in that Babylon was the great religious center, it was the great cultural center, and people would talk about just the sheer culture of Babylon was insane. And we've done archaeology of Babylon, and you hear about you'll see these giant beautiful statues, or the hanging gardens of Babylon, which were these artificial gardens built on scaffolds to look like mountains, or the seven gates. And Babylon was just supposed to be ridiculously beautiful. And when the Assyrians burned down Babylon, and this is 1,000 years later, that was considered to be one of the greatest atrocities ever committed. It would be like if the Americans nuked Rome and Paris now. And it's funny, a lot of things that we see as very recent are very old, where Babylon had its own feminist movement, as an example. where when the Amorites were formed, women had no legal rights, and by the end of their civilization, women had legal equality with men. And so the Babylonians built this empire, and Hammurabi was a Babylonian. And Hammurabi was the founder of the old Babylonian Empire. And past this point, Mesopotamian history gets relatively boring, where Mesopotamia solidifies into two states. You have the Babylonians in the south and the Assyrians in the north. And we're talking from, let's say, 2000 BC to 800 BC. So this is a 1,000-year time frame where I could scarcely tell you what happened, because it's just these two different countries. And by this point, civilization had moved beyond Mesopotamia. So you had Egypt and Babylon were allies for a very long time. You had the Hittites in the north, in Turkey. You had the Greeks forming a state in Mycenae. You had Syria as a bunch of wealthy city-states. You had the oldest civilization, older than Mesopotamia actually, were the Elamites in Western Persia. No one knows what the Elamites. Like, we have basically no records on the Elamites. And this area had so many wars that they're not really, frankly, that useful to talk about as a modern person. And so the Hittites, as an example, burned down Babylon once. The Elamites attacked Babylon. The Egyptians attacked up into northern Mesopotamia. And that sounds like a lot of wars, but keep in mind, we're looking at a 1,000-year time frame. If we were to talk about all the wars going on in Europe in the last 200 years, it would sound like the Europe's in constant warfare. But if you're living in France today, you've never seen a major war. This is a bias that people talk about when we read out ancient or medieval history, because we forget how big the time frames are. And the two competing states, we've talked about Babylon. Assyria was up north, where Assyria was another barbarian kingdom. And the more ancient and medieval history you read, the more you realize that the natural pattern of history, as civilization arises, people grow weak. New barbarians show up. New barbarians are strong. They dominate the civilized. The barbarians grow civilized. Process restarts. And this is something moderns will scoff at. But once you've read enough ancient or medieval history, it's just so completely obvious. And so the Assyrians were a new barbarian people from North Mesopotamia. And Assyria maps almost perfectly onto Isis, where if you look at ISIS's territory, it's modern Assyria. It was the Assyrian kingdom. And I do wonder if there's some genetic or ethnic, because you do see ethnic continuities over history, where for example, you can correlate who fought in the English Civil War versus the American Civil War versus the current political strifes today. That's not here nor there, though. And Assyria were the Nazis of the ancient world, and I don't throw that around lightly. And the Assyrians were Assyria is in the middle of the map. Mesopotamia in general is in the middle of the map, but Assyria is especially so in the middle of the map. And so they were constantly being attacked. And due to that, in the same way Germany's in the middle of the map, the Germans got really tough and they got really disciplined and really organized. Assyria did the exact same thing. And they're built around the city of Nineveh. And Nineveh is across the border from Mosul, ISIS's capital. And Nineveh was also a great world city. Nineveh had the largest library in the world. It was a piece of art. And it's crazy how we can talk about the Assyrians being a bloodthirsty empire, and they were. But in the same way that Berlin or Munich or those cities are incredible, in the same way the Germans have added so much to civilization, it's true for the Assyrians as well. And Dan Carlin, who runs his podcasts are great. He says that we hear about the horrible things the Assyrians did, but we don't hear about the peace they brought to the world, how their society was ordered. And that's the duality of life. And it's funny that when you commit atrocities in the ancient or medieval world, historians apologize for you. And in modernity, once the atrocities are more recent, that's a lot harder to do. And the Assyrians, they were the first people to create a modern military. They made a standing army, they established a modern bureaucratic system, and the Assyrians pushed against the trend where they moved back to having armies of foot soldiers. And so the Assyrians democratized their social structure, and they were still this authoritarian government, but they got rid of the nobility, they got rid of the class oppression, and through that, they're able to unify the population to fight for them harder. But there's an important event I need to bring up that doesn't exactly fit into this narrative here, where there was a thing called the Bronze Age collapse. And the Bronze Age collapse is to this time period what the fall of Rome is to a later time period. And it's crazy that this stuff can happen and no one's heard of it. The Bronze Age collapse is when over a 40-year time frame, every major civilization except Mesopotamia and Egypt crashed and burned, where we need to make a Bronze Age collapse video in of itself. I would have to read like another 2 books in the topic to do it justice, though. And the Bronze Age collapse, it's really like the fall of Rome, one of those Rorschach tests about what you choose to care about. You could blame civilizational cycles, you could blame climate change, barbarian invasions, changes in military structure, changes in social structure. But there was a group of barbarians who were probably Italians called the Sea Peoples who blew up Greece, Turkey, Syria, and the whole region went into a dark age. And the irony is that the Iliad and the Bible both came out of the dark ages associated with the Bronze Age collapse. And it reset the game so you could have new factions emerge, like the Greeks or the Persians or the Indians or the Chinese. India and China also experienced civilizational collapse during the Bronze Age collapse. And the irony, though, is Mesopotamia was fine. Assyria was attacked by Syrian barbarians, and Assyria went through a dark age, but Mesopotamia was able to get through the Bronze Age collapse relatively unhindered in a similar way to Egypt did. And the way to imagine this is civilizations just ended, you're in a period of chaos. And who has the balls to keep going? And the answer is Assyria, where Assyria... And it's funny to talk about Syrian barbarians, that there's this entire faction of barbarians who we don't remember. But the Aramaean Syrian barbarians were a big deal. And they even nearly took Babylon. I said before that the Babylonians had to build a great wall to protect themselves against Syrian barbarians. But the Assyrian and Syrian. The Assyrians, they built up their big military, and then they just conquered across the whole region. And the Assyrians... Again, I'm simplifying a 400-year time frame, so please humor me. But the Assyrians built the biggest empire up to that point in history, and they just steamrolled all their opponents. And the Assyrians, they conquered Syria, all of Iraq, they conquered Babylon, and then they conquered Egypt and Israel. And the Assyrians did a lot of crazy stuff. They genocided the Elamites out of existence. It's this beautiful 3,000-year-old civilization. The Assyrians just killed all of them. The Assyrians burned Babylon to the ground. The Assyrians, they genocided the Jews to a certain degree. And the Assyrians, and you know that this is a different society when stuff like this happened. In the Assyrian capital, they would have propagandistic images of them horrifyingly torturing their opponents. So the Assyrians would have propaganda of them making a father crush his son's own bones and then eat them. Or they'd have propaganda about decapitating an entire family. Or they'd have propaganda of burning a city down twice. And the way their moral code worked is that they didn't believe this is a moral code without rationality, objectivity, or empathy. And that sounds insane until you see it. Because their idea is that in their world, and something interesting at the ancient worldview is that the more power you have, the better you are. So the gods aren't better people than us, they're just more powerful than us. And so their idea is that we are so powerful, we can crush everyone, thus that makes us great. And they got incredibly wildly hated. And I mean, it goes without saying. And if you read the Bible, so the Jews disliked the Babylonians more, but they didn't like the Assyrians. And I don't say that the Assyrians were the Nazis of the world lightly. And the Assyrians, because they were such horrible people, they just got the Babylonians and the Egyptians to constantly rebel against them. And it's almost like a comedy skit at points where for both the Babylonians and the Assyrians, it was the same. I think especially for the Babylonians, they had a leader called Necho. It was the same guy. He would run away into the swamps. So this one guy would launch a revolt in Babylon. He would lose. He would run away into the swamps. He would return, launch another revolt. The Assyrians would burn all the cities down. He would run away again into the swamp, then do it again. You can't make this stuff up. And the Egyptians had a similar thing. And it's one of those things where Teddy Roosevelt said, you can either have when you want to get someone to work with you, you've got the carrot, you've got the stick. The Assyrians were all stick. They didn't give carrots for working with them. And what happened over time is the Assyrians just ran out of guys. And they started hiring foreigners to fight for them. And reading history, one of the very worst things a country can ever do is hire foreigners in their military. If the US starts doing that, that will be my number one issue to stop. Because whenever a country hires foreigners, the foreigners don't care about the country and they immediately start predating off the people. And that's what happened where there must have been a point where like every young male Assyrian was dead. And the Assyrians also got wealthy enough that they didn't feel the need to fight, which is another reason why empires die. And the Assyrians kept on trying to conquer Armenia. And the Armenians are a very proud people. And it surprises me the Armenians don't take more pride in this. But the Armenians had this empire in the mountains, and the Assyrians kept attacking Armenia, and the Armenians just kept on killing off the Assyrian armies. And so the Assyrians really broke themselves on Armenia. And then afterwards, Mesopotamia is funny where you can just casually say this stuff for 5 seconds, but it's such a huge event. The Sumerians were a nomadic horse tribe from Ukraine, and the Sumerians invented the riding horses with arrows thing. And so the Sumerians attacked into Assyria, and they're like the Huns or the Mongols. They would have burned civilization down if they weren't stopped. And so the Assyrians were able to fight back the Sumerians in the mountains of Turkey and Armenia. And you have to give the Assyrians credit here for saving civilization. And in this very bloody series of wars against either fighting down the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and fighting off the Sumerians and invading the Armenians, the Assyrians just stopped functioning as a country. They had taken so many casualties, they just couldn't work. And so what happened is that there was an alliance between the Egyptian rebels, the Babylonian rebels, and a new tribe out of the grassland. And the thing is, the grassland just spawns tribes that attack outwards like a video game. And these tribes were the Medes. And the Medes are relatives of the Persians. They lived in the area around modern Azerbaijan. And so all three of them teamed up and in a 10-year period wiped out the Assyrian Empire off the face of the earth. And again, Dan Carlin covers this really well, where Assyria was it was probably the most advanced society in the world. Nineveh was their New York City. And then everyone hated the Assyrians so much, they burned Nineveh to a pulp, so much so that the glass melted and no one was left in Nineveh. And a Greek army walked by 200 years later and said, hey, what are those ruins? And the local population had no idea what the ruins were because Assyria got so pwned that people even forgot they existed 200 years later. And it's funny. So back where I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, our plumber was an Assyrian Christian. So there still are some ethnic Assyrians. They're a tiny minority. But the Assyrians as a nation just got wiped out. And out of this came Babylon, and the Medes formed their empire, and the Egyptians got freedom. And so the entirety of Mesopotamia became a Babylonian possession. And the Neo-Babylonian Empire, it's probably the most famous of the Mesopotamian empires. And that's because they oppressed the Jews a lot. So whenever anyone thinks of this time period, their general lens into it is the Bible, which is weird because the Bible's not an objective measurement. It would be like in 4,000 years if everyone understood the modern world through how the Mormons' perspective on it was. Um, and and the Babylonians tried to genocide the Jews because the Jews kept on rebelling, and the Jews had a tremendous amount of pride. And so the Babylonians would resettle the Jews into Babylon. And so this was the huge turning point in Jewish history that we'll cover whenever we make a Jewish civilization video. And the problem, though, in the Babylonians, even though they're the most famous, they lasted for less than 100 years because just Mesopotamian civilization had run out of steam. And the Babylonians are just, the Neo-Babylonian Empire is just incredibly depressing to look at. It's completely degenerate. It's disgusting. It's class oppression. It's complete social degeneracy. It's like, so the Bible was written to avoid these guys. I think that's whatever Judeo-Christian religions tell you not to do, they tell you not to do that because they saw the Babylonians do it. Most people were slaves. The religion was corrupt. Like literally the temples pushed prostitution and there were prostitutes everywhere. There's a reason we call places Babylon. And it's funny that like this is one of the eras of history where the rednecks are the ones who write the story, where David Graeber talks at this time period, and there's been this permanent battle in the Middle East between the city dwellers and the redneck herders. And what's consistently happened is that the herders and the rural people won out. And so Judaism and Islam, these are all religions made by the rural people against the city people. And there's a funny story. I think I got the name of the earlier leader who kept rebelling against the Assyrians wrong. The last Babylonian emperor was named Necho. And this is a fascinating story where Necho was really interested in archaeology, where his biggest hobby as emperor of Babylon was digging up the archaeological sites of previous societies. And that's cool because it shows that this is a society, I guess 2,500 years ago. We're about 500 BC now. And there was already civilization long enough that there were ruined cities that you could dig up as a hobby. And Necho hated the traditional religion. He thought that the priests had become parasitic. And so he was attempting to build his own new religion against the old priest classes. And this is an agnostic society where the priest classes had gotten so corrupt and the society had developed so much, people didn't trust the old religion. Keep in mind, we're in the time period of the Axial Age, which we made a video about. And so Babylon was split between this strife between church and state, between countless degeneracies and slavery. And so when the Persians seized Babylon, the Babylonians opened the gates for them, because this is a sign of a society which had degenerated so much that they would rather be conquered by a barbarian people than rule themselves, because the priests hated Necho. The priest temples hated Necho so much they would rather have the Persians dominate them than themselves. And Mesopotamian civilization died with a whimper, not with a bang, where it was conquered by the Persians. And the Persians established this truly great empire that's wider across than America. It would stretch longer than the contiguous United States, from Serbia to India. And the Persians were enlightened. The early Persian Empire was legitimately one of the best empires ever. And it was led by Cyrus the Great, who's got to be one of the top 5 leaders ever, where even Cyrus the Great's enemies, the people he conquered. So in the Jewish Bible, they say that Cyrus the Great was something like one of 3 non-Jews who gets to be an honorary Jew because he's so good. And Cyrus the Great conquered that region and they just gave up. And so Mesopotamian civilization was taken in by conquerors. And this is true of the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. I like to say that if your society was successful in the Bronze Age, it's probably like every society that was popular in the Bronze Age, except China, would never had a single period of independence from 500 BC until the end of European colonialism. So from 500 BC until 1950, the area of Iraq and Egypt and Pakistan was never governed by local kingdoms. And Iraq had burned through its social capital so much that there was no trust. And so the Babylonians and that area, it was ruled by the Persians first, then it was ruled by the Greeks, then it was ruled by the Persians again, and the Romans had a brief stint. The Arabs ruled it, the Turks ruled it, the Mongols, the Persians again, the British, and now the mercenaries in that area of the world are Afghans. And I think that if the UN world order collapses, maybe the Afghans will become military dictators of Iraq. And the thing is that that area of the world was the wealthiest place in the world for a long time. And I've always wondered what was going on in the Middle East under those colonies, under the Persians or the Greeks. And the thing is, it was very wealthy, and inside that area came a religious golden age. So in Mesopotamia, after it was colonized, the people there were smart, they were very creative, they were rich, but it just gradually became a colonial society, and they lost the ability to lead themselves or to have pride. And over time, the region got poorer and poorer, where as late as the 13th century, modern Iraq was still one of the wealthiest places in the world. And then the Mongols torched it, and then Islam turned anti-capitalist. And I think that there is a great irony that Iraq, when George W. Bush, I think it's George H.W., both George Bushes invaded Iraq. When both George Bushes invaded Iraq, they called it a war for civilization. But it's funny that America was fighting a war for civilization in the place where civilization started, and that's Mesopotamia.
That's a great overview.
Thank you.
Of time, is there anything we haven't gotten to, or anything you want to make sure?
No, that was a pretty good overview. Let me just go through the books. So I referenced this book a bunch of times, Against the Grain by James Scott. You should also read the other stuff James Scott's written. Everything by Will Durant is the best history on that topic. So I haven't read these two books. The Assyria book by Eckhart Fromm and Weaver, Scribes and Kings by Padani. I've heard my manager's read both and loves them. And Isaac Asimov's history on Mesopotamia is super good. And so I would recommend that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's wrap with that. And do we know which topic we want to do next time?
I don't. You can either throw something out or I'll just pick it.
Cool. Awesome. We'll chat on text, and
okay.
If people
Sounds good.
Comments, feel free. Roger, always a pleasure. Until next week.
Thank you. Peace.